Good evening, everybody. Welcome along, and thank you very much for coming back after what feels like weeks and weeks of letdowns on my part. I apologise. I'm sorry for all of that. First of all, COVID took over and wiped me out for a little while. Then, of course, it was the internet gods. I'm back at home this week, and we are hopefully back on track and got so much to discuss. So much so that I don't even know where on earth we should start. I've just been dipping in and out the chat. Why don't you get your Valtteri Bottas jokes in now? Let's get them out the way, just like, let's say 5 minutes, and after 5 minutes, we'll ban the Valtteri Bottas jokes. So go for it, get them in, and we'll see what you've got. But there's so much to cover. I want to very quickly, and I don't want this show to be about Silverstone and the British Grand Prix, because that seems like ages ago, but I haven't spoken to you all since then, and I really wanted to. So I'm just going to give you my take on that incident at the start. And really, it boils down to the fact that I think it's a racing incident. Yes, if you want to really pick it apart, you know, you've got to find more fault with Lewis than with Max Verstappen. But, you know, it feels like to me one of those things a little bit like VAR in football, finding somebody with a shoulder or a bit of their shirt offside. It was that close. And if we're starting to pick things apart to that level of detail, well, people won't end up making the moves. And what I take from all of that is that racing between Max and Lewis on their opening lap, that is what we all want to see, isn't it? The two title protagonists going wheel to wheel from corner to corner. And yeah, occasionally it goes wrong. But you know what? It was so exciting. It was brilliant. That's exactly, for me, what F1 should all be about. So it should have been, in my mind, a racing incident. Let them get on with it. Yes, I know, on that occasion, the Max Verstappen fans, along with Max, are going crazy because they feel hard done by. But on another day, it could well have been Lewis that came off worse on that one. So I'm certainly not picking sides between drivers. I'm looking at it, trying to look at it from a neutral, from a fan's perspective. It was great racing all the way through that first half a lap, and it ended in tears. And obviously the way the race then panned out, it worked out very, very nicely for Lewis Hamilton, but that's not down to that first lap incident. It was a case of the incident, Max came off far worse. But the rest of the race, Lewis did a fantastic job to fight his way back. You can argue whether the penalty was right or wrong, or harsh enough, or lenient, too lenient. You know, we can argue that for days. But ultimately, I want to see cars racing. I want to see them touching. I want to see them going wheel to wheel if that's how they want to race. If they want to get their elbows out. And if we penalise that too much and too frequently, well, we'll just lose it. We've been complaining about not enough wheel-to-wheel action over the past few years. We've got it all of a sudden, and everyone's leaping on the bandwagon to find somebody to blame for it. And, you know, I get it. If we're looking for someone to blame, it has to be Lewis Hamilton. It has to be Lewis. The penalty then can be discussed. But ultimately, I want to see more of that racing happening. And so, for that to happen, we need to let them sort it out to some extent on track. Albeit, I've got to take the safety side of things. That was a very dangerous incident, and it was lucky that Max got away with it. But I don't want the show to be all about that. So I just thought I'd give you my opinion, and let's move it on now to the Hungarian Grand Prix, because even from just this latest race on Sunday, there's so much to cover. So let's get the Valtteri Bottas jokes. Bottas goes thermonuclear. Bottas loses his no claim bonus again. Let's get a couple more. What else have we got about Valtteri Bottas, and then we'll move on. Valtteri Bottas, what does this button do? Bottas's favourite winter sport is curling. Yes, Bottas to NASCAR. Was Bottas managing the hotel Wi-Fi last week? Bottas to Uber. Yeah, okay, should we move it on from Valtteri Bottas? Yeah, there we go. So look, I know that some of you will agree with my Silverstone assessment, and that's a very brief overview of my assessment. We can go into all sorts of detail. Some will agree, some won't, and that is partly what's great about all this, isn't it? 2 weeks later, we're still talking about it. The teams are still arguing about it. We've got a soap opera building in the paddock, and you know, think about next season's Netflix series. I mean, with this stuff going on this year, it's going to be a must watch, isn't it? So look, for me, that's a positive. That's the sort of thing Formula One is thriving on. Now, let's get into, all right, let's wipe out the bot. It's 9:05. That's an end. Bottas jokes now banned. Come on, let's move it on to the racing in Hungary, or the Hungarian Grand Prix weekend, which I thought was just brilliant. Again, it's full of unpredictable stuff. The weather, of course, played a big part in that. More incidents, more accidents, upturned results, and it's turning this championship into something that, you know, it is going to keep everybody on the edge of their seats. And that, again, is great for the sport. That's what this sport should be. It should be a series of twists and turns of some drivers just suffering a bit of bad luck, some having some good luck, some drivers lucking into a wonderful result like Esteban Ocon did this weekend, some drivers being penalised because they've breached technical regulations like Sebastian Vettel. Harsh though that is, these are the twists and turns of a soap opera-like dramatic season that we, I think, have missed in Formula One for years. I mean, the last time I can remember this level of stuff happening was the chaos of 2007 with us, but even that was just really intra-team. And then beyond that, it was the McLaren versus Ferrari era when I first got into this sport, when it was Mika Hakkinen versus Michael Schumacher, and the end of the 90s, beginning of the 2000s, when the two teams are so ferociously fighting against each other that the two sets of fans ferociously fought against each other. It was like football crowds at races. And, you know, if you've read my book, you will know some of those stories. The fans were so angry and ferocious and taking it out at almost violent levels. And I'm not suggesting that anyone should get violent, but that level of passion has been missing for years and years, and we have it back, and we should be embracing this. Whether you're a Max Verstappen fan or a Lewis Hamilton fan, or somewhere in the middle, or just sitting on and watching from afar, this is great entertainment, which ultimately is at the heart of what Formula One should be. It's entertainment, and I am loving every second of it, and there's no way that any of you can sit there and tell me that you won't be tuning into the next Grand Prix, at least in some way, because of everything that's happened up until now. So it's a great way to go into the summer break. It keeps everybody glued to the sets, aching for more, desperate for the next race to come around, and that is absolutely brilliant. So let's get into the Hungarian Grand Prix then. Let's talk about some of these moments across the weekend. I mean, you tell me where you want to start. Still some Valtteri Bottas jokes coming in, but drop it. Let's open up the feed for some serious questions about this weekend. So let's have a look then. What should we start with? Let's talk first of all about, okay, I see somebody saying there, Jason Mant saying Christian Horner is like a baby throwing his toys out of his cot, and he's bang out of order with his comments. So I personally think that Christian Horner and Red Bull generally didn't come out of the whole Silverstone incident looking good. I think from a fan's perspective, so fans looking onto this sport, it was them that kind of, I know they were the worst hit, obviously. They came out of that whole on-track incident far more harshly hit, as they have again this weekend, than Mercedes have. But the way they've played it over the course of the media and of course of the appeal system and everything else over the 2 weeks, I don't think looked good on Red Bull. And ultimately, they have a car that is worthy of winning a championship, and I'd love to see them just get on with that racing on track and do it that way round from their perspective. I think that would have been a better way to approach it, but as I said, it adds to the spice that this season is building into. So let's see. Okay, so a question about, here's a good one. Was it a good advert for reverse grids, do you think? So was it a good advert? I'm not sure it was an advert for reverse grids at all necessarily this weekend. I mean, I think some of you know my feelings on reverse grids. I think we should be just experimenting in the same way we experimented with a sprint race. Why not experiment with a reverse grid? I don't think it's something that necessarily we need, and that is also my opinion on the sprint race, by the way. I loved the sprint race at Silverstone. I thought it was great. I thought it was a great addition to the weekend, but not something that Formula One needs. But on a weekend where you have a double header, for example, 2 races at the same event, like we had in Austria, for example, like we've had at Silverstone in the past, a great way to spice up the second weekend or one of the 2 weekends by doing something a bit different. Reverse grids for me would sort of fall into that category, at least until we've experimented and know how it's all going to work out. Right, so why was Bottas so slow off the line? I'm going to take it that's not a joke and that's a serious question. Bottas just got massive wheel spin. I mean, let's talk about the start of the race, because that weather, which, as I said, added to the spectacle that was the Hungarian Grand Prix, kind of caught everybody out. Nobody really had an idea of how to play that. And the start procedures are so finely tuned in a Formula One car in the modern day. They are practiced and prepped and analysed, all the practice starts that they do over the weekend. And then, of course, the conditions changed and nobody had data or practice or any information as to how to play that. And we're talking about your revs, the level of revs, how quickly you dump the first phase of the clutch release, and then how quickly you're able to feed it in, how much grip your grid slot has when you launch it off the line. And those things all make a massive difference. And of course, Valtteri Bottas got that wrong massively, and it was part of that desperation to recover that ended up with that absolute bowling ball incident going into turn one. So a disastrous start. The crash and everything that ensued afterwards all began with a terrible start and loads of wheel spin off the line, and the desperation to recover that was probably where he made his big mistake a few metres further on. Let's go. Makayo says, I dislike the sprint format. Just focus on improving the Grand Prix. Do we need to improve the Grand Prix? I mean, we had a race at a circuit yesterday, which is a circuit that typically is incredibly hard to overtake on. And we saw that. We saw some of the worst bits of modern Formula One at the Hungaroring, where cars were held up behind other cars and just simply couldn't get past, even though the chasing car was faster. But did it detract from the Grand Prix, or did it actually add to it? Because drivers had to become a bit more desperate. The Fernando Alonso-Lewis Hamilton battle on track was just a perfect example of that. Lewis had a faster car but couldn't get past and had to get creative. He had to get a little bit desperate. He had to get his elbows out, as Fernando was doing as well. And as a result, we got some great racing for a couple of laps until Lewis managed to find his way past. So, you know, do we need to really spice up the racing? Do we need to do something to change the way Formula One is? Or is the fact that we're coming to the end of a period of regulations where generally the technical regs have been stable for some time, more or less, certainly when it comes to power units now, and the performance is beginning to converge, and now we've got cars that are closely matched on the racetrack, and therefore, as a result of that, we're getting some great racing. Next year, of course, it's all going to change. The cars change, the rules change, and possibly the competitive order will change too. So we may well be looking back at this year, as we have done in the final year of previous stable regulations, and think, do you know what, that was absolutely brilliant racing we got towards the end of that period. And that, I feel, is what we've got now. It's spicy enough now, says NJO. Absolutely, I agree. Mick defending against Verstappen, says Thomas Pacheco. Absolutely, same sort of thing. It's great, wasn't it? And Verstappen, okay, massively damaged car at that point in the Grand Prix, but Mick Schumacher had his elbows out. He wasn't going to give up those places easily. Those overtakes weren't just a given. They weren't just a case of being able to breeze past on a straight. It's a circuit where you have so many corners that come in thick and fast around the entire lap that, first of all, that doesn't give you some massive long DRS straight to just breeze past somebody. And secondly, because there's so many relentless corners coming one after the other, you get this constant loss of downforce when you start following another car. You're always in the turbulent cornering situation because most of the lap is simply corners, and that's what hampered a lot of people. It's what meant it was difficult to follow. It started to upset your tyres, but it also meant that drivers had to get a little bit creative if they wanted to get past, and sometimes it took longer than maybe we would have liked, but on other times it produced some spectacular stuff. So I enjoyed every moment of it. George Russell is testing tyres for Mercedes. He is, absolutely. I don't think we need to read too much into that, but you know, George Russell again had a fantastic day in parts yesterday, didn't he? Great to see him and the Williams team getting their first points. That was another big plus from the weekend, a nice feel-good moment. Let's talk about Sebastian Vettel's disqualification, says Paul Slathers. Let's do that. I felt incredibly sorry for Seb. It's certainly not Seb's fault, was it? You know, that is a minor miscalculation by the team, but had drastic consequences. Now, I've read today that they are considering an appeal. first of all, I'd be amazed actually if they do go down the route of appeal, because I can't think of many grounds that would actually justify one. I've been there in the past where in the olden days you used to be able to take the fuel lines off your car and literally almost wring the lines out, drain your lines to get that 1 litre of fuel. You're not allowed to do that anymore. You're not allowed to go in and take the tank apart to start scavenging out extra fuel. The pumps on the car have to be able to pump out 1 litre of fuel. It's through a QD or a dry brake on the system that the FIA then plug into, and it has to be done that way. And if you can't do that, you fall foul of the regulations. The question is, do we actually need to be having that regulation in place, anymore these days anyway? Do we need to be able to produce 1 litre of fuel at the end of a Grand Prix? Or could we just test the fuel specifications before a Grand Prix to make sure it's the right fuel, that it matches the samples, and then let them go for it in the Grand Prix? Whether they finish on fumes or with a litre left, that could then be up to the teams. It doesn't have to spoil a Grand Prix like it did yesterday, where a team falls foul of it. Now, look, they are the rules, and all of the teams have to work to those rules. There's nobody to blame here other than Aston Martin. They got it wrong, and ultimately that's what happens. If you break the rules, you get penalised, so they can't really argue that. But there's perhaps a bigger question moving forward, much more longer term. Do we really need to be doing that when it might spoil the record books or change the result hours after the Grand Prix is finished, when actually there might be a better way or another way that we could test the fuel on the way to the grid, or once the cars are fueled up and the fuel tanks are sealed before the Grand Prix, we could potentially do it there rather than after the race. Of course, that was an old rule that came in from the refueling days, where during a Grand Prix you could dump more fuel into your car, and therefore testing before a race would have no effect because you could put more fuel in during. Today that doesn't happen, and so it feels like there's a sensible way that we could do that before the race and then just let them go for it. But that's a much bigger question, and unfortunately for Sebastian Vettel and their team, they have fallen foul of a rule, and barring any really bizarre circumstances, I can't see them getting themselves out of that one personally. Is there any credit for Latifi? Totally. I mean, Latifi, as I said, for George Russell and the Williams team, including Latifi, both of those guys had a great weekend, and it's just great for everybody in that team to get points. All of those guys, from Ocon to Sebastian Vettel and then Latifi and others, Sainz, all of those guys who found themselves on the inside of turn one where the melee happened, managed to catapult themselves way up the grid. And from there, it was a case of managing the Grand Prix. And of course, we know that Esteban Ocon did that almost faultlessly from lap one right through to the end. And that's why he deserves so much credit. He did it under immense pressure from Sebastian. Great credit to Sebastian as well. He managed to, get through that Grand Prix. He didn't manage to pull the overtake, and that was one of those things I've been talking about where it's difficult to get past there. Perhaps he didn't feel like he could be aggressive enough because there was so much to lose. But also, we've seen Sebastian mess up in those situations over and over again over the years, and this weekend he didn't do that. He executed the race strategy very well. He got to the end in second, and it would have been an amazing result for him and the team if that had stood. Could they have a fuel reservoir in the tank? Not sure what you mean, Andy Nixon, sorry. Come back to me on that one. Tell me what you're talking about and I will answer that one if I can. Okay, what about Lewis Hamilton being the only driver on the grid at the restart? It looked quite comical, says Zoe Fletcher. It did look comical, didn't it? It was one of those bizarre scenes that I'm sure makes some very funny photographs, and a little bit like that crazy race in Indianapolis that I was part of, where only 6 cars lined up then for very different reasons. Obviously, it's one of those weird anomalies in Formula One. Now, let's break this apart then, because this is obviously a big talking point. Big mistake from the team. However, what I would say, and everybody's been criticising Mercedes and Lewis for that mistake early on. And look, it's very easy to do that, of course, now. One thing I would say in Lewis or Mercedes' favour in that scenario is it's very difficult to do that when you're the first car, when you're the lead car on pole position. It's a much harder decision to make, because quite often what could have happened was, if it was on the edge, and I know it was much more dry, it seemed like a fairly clear decision. But if you're the lead driver and you do pit, and let's say it's a close call, and let's say there might be rain on the way, the guys behind you then have the option to do the opposite to what Lewis is doing. And if it happens to play out slightly differently, well, Lewis has made a pit stop that the others aren't making and falls further back. So when you have track position, and ultimately starting from pole position, that's the ultimate track position at that point, where you're starting the Grand Prix from the lead. To give that up, to risk giving that up when at that stage you don't yet know what everyone else is going to do, is a big gamble. Having said that, it seemed like a fairly clear-cut decision. It seemed like an obvious decision, and they didn't make it, and they paid a price for it later on. And actually, if you wind back even further, you could even argue that everybody made the mistake of even going out on that formation lap, after the red flag, without putting slicks on at that stage, because it seemed like that was the right thing to do, didn't it? It seemed like even going to the grid, if you'd made the decision to go onto slicks at that stage, you could have had a big advantage. And let's just say Lewis had done that, leaving the pit lane, well, I think he would have walked away hands down, winning that Grand Prix and taken the full 25 points. So you can argue that these teams have made poor decisions or mistakes with hindsight, but in the moment, and believe me, I've been there, it's always a much harder decision than it looks from when you're sitting on your sofa watching it on TV. But you've got to say, on this time, they got it wrong. The next question, I haven't seen it here, but oh, we go, I have just seen it there. Who asked that one? Noel Rivera, because lots of people asked me this over the course of today. What would happen if Lewis had pitted as well, leaving nobody on the grid? And that is a good question, and it kind of, I mulled it over at the time. I know the answer, and the answer is that if all the cars had gone into the pit lane, leaving nobody in the grid, I mean, they would have still gone through the normal start procedure. So as the last car pulled into the pit lane, that would have been almost as if the last car was pulling up on the grid. The 5 lights would have come on and gone out as normal on the grid. And at that point, the green light would have then illuminated at the end of the pit lane. Normally what happens is the light at the end of the pit lane only goes green once the last car has gone round from the start and gone past the pit lane exit, and then they turn the pit lane exit lights green. Well, if no cars had gone past, that pit lane exit light would go green as the race starts, and effectively they would all file out of the pit lane in the order that they were lined up, and that would have been the start of the Grand Prix. So it would have been bizarre. I mean, it was bizarre. It was bizarre anyway, but that's how it would have worked. Right. Okay, so Paul Slathers says, the penalties for Lewis Hamilton and Valtteri Bottas in the last 2 races seem weak, considering that both Red Bulls will take engine penalties. So this is the kind of question I do want to get into, because yes, it does seem harsh, and there are lots of ways to look at all of this, a little bit like Max Verstappen at Silverstone. The consequences of what happened on that incident, and again this weekend, the knock-on effects of what happened are obviously going to be far more severe to Red Bull. I think Sergio Perez has already talked about potentially needing a new engine or losing that engine in that crash. We may well see others that have had that effect too. And further down the line in the championship, it may well cost them grid penalties if they have to go over their engine allocation. But what you can't do is, if and when that happens, you can't then come back and go, well, that was all because of this particular incident at a race 3 months ago, and because that's happened, the penalties were too lenient back then. You can't necessarily look at the consequence or the outcome of an incident. You have to penalise the infringement. So Valtteri Bottas got his braking point horribly wrong. He misjudged a corner. He was out of control, and as the steward said, wholly to blame for that accident yesterday. So you punish that. You punish that, causing an accident which was wholly your fault. That's the punishment, and they're the penalty as a result of that. You can't then go on to say, well, hang on a minute, because now Sergio Perez has got to take a new engine and that will cost him further down the line. Or the knock-on effect was that 2 other cars hit each other, or one car hit a barrier and it's smashed the car to bits. It's going to have a knock-on effect of costing them millions of pounds, and therefore Valtteri should be penalised more. You can't do that. You penalise the incident or the failure or the thing that he did wrong, And unfortunately, when it works out against you, the consequences you have to suck up. That is racing. And in a cost-capped environment, that's becoming more and more of a contentious issue, isn't it? Are they going to have to start looking at when you get an incident like that seems like you're predominantly or wholly at fault with one driver for it? Should you be coming back to that team to subsidise some of the cost of these things if you're then found to be in breach of the cost cap regulations? It's a much bigger discussion than that. It's a very complicated and difficult one, a very messy discussion. And the way things are right now, we don't get into that. We just penalise the incident or the infringement. And I think that's the right way to do it as things stand. So should the engine penalties be more lenient when one is destroyed in a crash, says Beleg Kuthalion. Well, that's another good point, but then you get into this discussion of, well, was the crash your fault or was it somebody else's fault? If you spin at a corner in the wet, stick your car in the wall and smash the engine into the barriers and damage it, that's your fault. That's something that is just your fault, and I don't think there should be any leniency there. That's a part of you getting it wrong as a driver, but also as a team. Same as if your engine blows up. You as a group of people, including the driver and the team, have somehow made some kind of error, and it may well cost you an engine. When it gets into this messy scenario of, well, it wasn't really my fault that I had the crash, or it was only partly my fault, it becomes hugely complicated to sort out. And sometimes I think these things just go against you, and on other days it will work for you. Lewis Hamilton has come out of the last two races quite lucky, in all honesty, hasn't he? He's come out of this, A, in the championship lead, but B, have a massive turnaround in points because his main rival has suffered some massive bad luck. But there'll be other occasions, and there have been other occasions in previous years where it's worked the other way, and this is sport. And sometimes you have to just accept that. A bit of good luck or a bit of bad luck can change a championship. It can win or lose a championship. Believe me, I've seen it. I've had cars fail on the closing lap of a race when you're leading. With Mika Hakkinen at Barcelona and with Kimi Räikkönen at the Nürburgring. It's heartbreaking. And you just want to find someone else to blame for it, but it's just sport. That's the way sport goes on certain occasions, and it's cruel, it's heartbreaking, and as a fan of that driver, it's heartbreaking for you too, but you have to suck it up and just hope over the season or over a career, it evens itself out. How were the Alpines so fast in the straights? They have been quite quick at times. It's funny, isn't it? Because at certain races they've actually been quite slow, and you've got to assume from that it's down to downforce levels and the level that they put on their car. Of course, they're constantly trimming downforce levels. With downforce levels comes the associated drag penalty, and look, we've seen this at the front. We've seen this in swinging between Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen. The way they put their downforce onto the car has had a huge impact in the way the car performs, both in terms of the straights and how vulnerable they are on the straights, but then we've seen it in the corners where you're able to look after your tyres, you're able to keep hold of the grip with a certain downforce level, but somebody else might need more downforce to look after their tyres through the same set of corners, and it swings and roundabouts. It felt to me like at the Hungaroring, which is typically a high downforce circuit, the Alpines may have been running something slightly lower than perhaps some of their main rivals were, and as a result of that, they got some great end of straight speeds as a result. Alpine were decent on the straight last year too. Yeah, I mean, they haven't been necessarily one of these slower cars. They may not have the outright best engine, but particularly around this circuit, they've found a balance with aero that seems to have worked with their power unit and with their grip levels and everything else, and it works out really nicely for them. Let's not forget that when you're in the lead of a Grand Prix, it is much easier than if you're chasing, if you're following other cars with the turbulent air that comes off all of that. So that also has a massive impact on your speed, your speed around a lap, but also your tyre usage over the course of a Grand Prix as well. JustPack says, Mark, how do the mechanics approach a situation like repairing Max's damaged car during a short red flag period? Is there a methodical approach and how to prioritise what to fix? It's a good point, and what happened, of course, in the situation that Red Bull were facing this time around was you don't know how long you have in that red flag scenario. When you're going to the grid like Max's mechanics had last year with the broken suspension, you know when the race is going to start. So you know how much time you have, and therefore you can prioritise certain jobs, or you know what you can fit into that time period. But here, it was an unknown period of time. They were clearing up the circuit, but at any point, the race director could have come along and said, right, we're going to restart in 10 minutes. Or he might have said, we're going to start in 15 minutes or 20 minutes. And that's a really difficult one to figure out. And I think what they did quite well was they patched up the damage. They first of all had to make it safe so that bits weren't going to fly off. And then they have to make a very rough assessment. And it would have been incredibly rough as to which bits to try and repair, try and patch up with tape, simply which ones to rip off the car because they might cause more harm than good, and simply go for it and make the best of it. And it was a proper, rough and ready solution, but all they could achieve in that time, and they did that well. They kept things under control, they kept the scene calm, and they got Max back into the race. And all right, he had a very damaged car which hampered him during the Grand Prix, but he got to the end. He got to the finish of that Grand Prix with a relatively fast car. He was able to race some other cars along the way. So you've got to say they did a pretty decent job in some pretty tough conditions. Evil Pingu, great name by the way, says thoughts on Sainz refusing to pit. So that, I've also had mixed feelings on that, okay, when a driver refuses to follow an instruction from his team. And, I've been there where I've sat on the radio and my own driver has done that. Kimi, notably, used to quite often go rogue and do his own thing. And at times you sort of think, well, it's great that your driver's being assertive, that he's got his experience and he's the one sat in the car. He's got the only perspective that he has that no one else has. But on the flip side, he only has a tiny amount of the information. And this is what I always used to come back to. The team have so much more information to hand that the driver simply doesn't have, both on your own car in terms of data, but also the bigger picture of the race, of what everyone else is doing, that a driver simply cannot compute. And in most scenarios, that big picture thinking that the team are able to see, looking at other people's strategies and how you might fit into that, looking at the gaps on the racetrack, it's that information that actually tends to normally come up with the best solution or the best outcome. And I always have felt, particularly when I was in the garage, that the drivers should just do what they're told in most situations like that. However, I have to say Carlos Sainz got it right this weekend, and this is something that I think we've seen Charles Leclerc do in the past. And I don't want to be overly critical of Ferrari again, because I feel like I've done that a lot. But over recent years, Ferrari haven't been the sharpest when it's come to strategy, and the drivers often have led the way. The engineering team on the radio have often sounded unsure of themselves, like they haven't had their own conviction in their own decisions. And so sometimes I've seen Charles Leclerc step on the radio and say, listen guys, I need to know what to do, or I think we should do this. It felt like one of those situations, and on that moment Carlos Sainz kind of got it right, didn't he? And so those decisions are always vindicated if they go your way afterwards. But it's a really difficult one to sort of play team against driver. It's always got to be a joint decision. The team have to take into consideration what the driver thinks, but the driver has a minute amount of information compared to the team. So fine balancing act, and I think for them it generally worked out pretty well in the end. Okay, this is a good one. Alexis V. Teams should make those parts swappable so they can easily fix and replace those aero parts. Now that is a good question, and I have direct experience of this. And actually it was Adrian Newey. When I was working with Adrian at McLaren, we had a barge board on our car, this huge deflector, huge component. And again, I think this story's in my book. But we had a huge component that in the early days of these barge boards, nowhere near as complex as they are today. But Adrian was so adamant that the best way for the aero to work was to have the front top wishbone go through the middle of this huge barge board. And the obvious thing would be to have a little slot in that barge board so you could slot it over the front wishbone and then just bolt it in place and maybe put a little infill panel in to take up the slot that you'd cut. Adrian wouldn't have that because he said that slot that you cut compromised his aero, and it had to be a one-piece thing that had to slot over or fit over the wishbone, have the wishbone go through a hole in this barge board. Now the only way to do that was to remove the wishbone to then fit one of these barge boards, which is a huge, complex job, time-consuming job, incredibly frustrating. But I was adamant, he was adamant that's what we had to do. And if we had a crash, which we did, in those moments when it was desperate, of course, we just got the cutter out, we cut one off and we slotted another one and we jammed it in place to save time. But Adrian was always adamant that's how it had to be. And that really, there's some truth in all of that. These components are so complex, particularly today, that they are so fine, the details are so fine that if you make them swappable, there's a compromise there in the design. And you can't compromise on a design that's that intricate and detailed, because if you compromise, what's the point of going to all of that level of detail in the first place? It's that level of detail and that complex design that gives you the performance of all of these tiny little flick ups and parts. So it's a fine balancing act, and it is frustrating. And when you have those moments, it feels like, well, you've cost yourself time because you weren't able to replace the components quickly enough. But that's a rare occurrence. How many times over a season do you get that moment in a red flag with a bit of downtime, having to replace those parts? Very, very rare. And on the most part, you're looking for the optimum performance from these components, and that's why the design always favours whatever is the optimum aero setup, much more so than the thing being practical. I once said to Adrian Newey, in the midst of being really frustrated with mucking about with one of these deflectors, one of these barge boards, I once said to Adrian, who was stood near me in the garage whilst I was mucking about with it, getting angry with it, I said, Adrian, when you're designing these things, I said, just roughly as a percentage of what goes into designing these components, I said, how much of that as a percentage do you think is around practicality and how much around aero performance? I said, how much of that do you ever consider what we're having to do with these things? He said, nothing. There's 0% goes into that. It's all about aero. And then he just walked off laughing. But it's true. That is how he feels. And that is why those components are designed the way that they are. Right, let's move it on. Did you like Rosberg's commentary? I did. I have a lot of time for Nico Rosberg. I think he's, particularly from a Sky perspective, I've worked with Nico in the past. I think he's a brilliant addition. He often just says it how he feels. He's not afraid to upset people or to tread on people's toes. He asks the right questions. And more so than that, he's got the most current, up-to-date perspective on A, driving these cars, and B, fighting against the likes of Lewis Hamilton and working with that team at Mercedes that have dominated the sport for so many years. So to have that, I think, is incredibly valuable through your TV. And as a commentator, I thought he added something this weekend too. So yeah, I thought it was a great addition. What did you guys think? Do you think a cost cap will play a part in the rest of the season? I do think it will have a bit more of an impact, I think, this year. I think... or more of an impact, have an impact. I think as we get through the season, you're going to start having, particularly perhaps for the teams that have had a lot of these big incidents, the Haas team, for example, they may not be anywhere near the cost cap in terms of their budget anyway, but just look at how many crashes they're having. This is turning out to be an expensive season for them, but it is for other people too. And you could argue that, well, that's what you're going to get if you put two rookie drivers in the car, and there's a lot of truth in that. I think a lot of people predicted an expensive season for the Haas team, but these things are going to start to add up, and they will have to compromise, perhaps updates and developments of the car. What is different, of course, this year is the developments are going to start to peter out anyway for most teams if they haven't already, and so it's not going to compromise the season as it might do, let's say, next season, when development parts are going to be coming all the time because the opportunities just keep popping up. You're going to be bringing a constant stream of new bits all the way through next season, up and down the grid. And if you start having a series of massive crashes and expensive crashes, those updates are going to be compromised. And so it will probably have a really serious impact on the outcome of performance over the course of a season. Could even affect a championship. What would happen if the safety car had a mechanical problem? Well, there are two. So first of all, there's two at each race. There's two medical cars, two safety cars. So if it happens, during the weekend, there are a team of mechanics dedicated to, I say a team, I think it's just two guys, to that whole fleet of FIA cars. So if there's a mechanical problem, they can switch to the other car whilst they fix the other one. But if it had a mechanical problem during the Grand Prix, well, they have the option of either getting the second car out if there's time, or they could always use the medical car to lead the race. For example, if it was an extended safety car period and the car failed or crashed or stopped or whatever, there is always that option. Or of course the race director can just red flag the race if that was felt to be a dangerous situation. So there's a number of options, but they always have a way around it in the end. Which safety car is the faster, the Merc or the Aston Martin? I don't know the answer to that one. Good one though. I think it's probably a question you'll never get an answer to because of the politics associated with those two brands sharing that the rights to that safety car over the course of this season. Seb's disqualification was harsh. Well, we've covered that a bit already. It's not harsh if they break the rules, is it? It might be a harsh rule, but if they broke it, they deserve to take the same penalty that anyone else would. Should the cameras on the airbox be 360 as they have on Indy cars? I'd like to see them make more of that. I mean, you know that all cars have a 360 camera on them. Just in front of the driver, you'll see they all have the same little bulge on the top of the chassis. That is actually a 360 camera. What they don't have, as far as I know, I don't think they have every car permanently linked with their 360 camera and manoeuvrable remotely in live. I think that's something that at the moment they may have remote capability with them live, but I'm not sure. I think they have to select certain cars because they can't get all camera feeds live from all cars at the same time. There isn't the bandwidth to do that. So they select certain cars and certain camera feeds on certain cars to have those as your live options during a Grand Prix. But the 360 camera is something that exists. All cars have it in terms of the technology. They have to have it. It's an FOM thing about how and when they use it and how they activate it. It's all data that's there to go back and look at retrospectively. So when you see the highlights reels afterwards, you quite often see that footage being used. I'm just not sure exactly how many cars or how they decide which ones to use in the live feed. Who's favourite for the Merc seat now, considering that Ocon fought off a four-time world champ? It's still got to be George Russell, I think. I think that seat is going to go... I personally think it's going to go to George Russell or it's going to stay with Valtteri. I don't think there's any other options at this point. And I honestly am not sure that they've made that decision yet. I think it's a difficult one. I think there's probably some internal pressure from Lewis to keep Valtteri, just to keep this... Not because I think he fears George Russell, but I think it's just to keep the status quo internally. That's a system that's worked for years. They've been very successful as a team. But from a Mercedes perspective, they're going to start thinking a bit longer term, and George Russell undoubtedly is looking like the future for them. So maybe getting him in the car now, having a year or two alongside Lewis, can be the perfect way to sort of hand over the baton, if you like, for when Lewis eventually does call it a day. And in theory, George Russell could be the one to take it on into the future. So we'll find out. I believe they're going to make the decision during this summer break. Whether they communicate that to the wider world at the end of the summer break, we'll find out very shortly. But unfortunately, Valtteri has made a number of costly errors, hasn't he, over the last year or two? And if you really add those up, you've got to say that George might be a better prospect from a performance perspective. How long do Mercedes plan to remain in F1 as a team? I mean, I don't know the answer to that. I would say that they are committed, though, to a sort of medium-term future at least. They just sold or restructured the team, didn't they? With Toto taking a third, Mercedes having a third, and Ineos taking a third. There is commitment, I think, behind all of this. They have signed up to the 2022 and beyond regulations. They are part of the discussions for engines from 2025 and beyond. So it doesn't feel to me at the moment like there's any desire for Mercedes to pull out, but we've seen this many times over the years. That can change in a moment. When a manufacturer decides they've had enough, they can just walk away almost whenever they want. Rob Farmer says, do helicopters really affect the aero as much as the drivers were complaining? That's a good point. And 2 races on the trot now, we've heard drivers complaining of this. And yes, absolutely, that helicopter really can affect the aero of the cars. We've seen it on rare occasions in the past, and actually there's a protocol that always says that the TV helicopter, and they always try and do this, should not be flying below a certain height over the racetrack. And they are mindful of that. They know the downwash from a helicopter is extreme. In the same way a Formula One car relies on its aero to get itself around the racetrack, of course a helicopter is reliant on aero from a different form, the downwash, to keep itself in the sky. So they are both looking at extreme aero, and the output from both of those can massively affect each other. So if we get a situation where the helicopter ends up over the racetrack below a certain height, absolutely it will really affect the performance of the car. Now, you could look at it and go, well, downwash from a helicopter, that's going to create downforce. The problem is it's not consistent. It's gusty, it's surprising, it's something that would really catch a driver out because they're not expecting it. So it can be a massive upset. Would you like to see a Finnish Grand Prix, says Gridblog. I would, and it's been one of those things that over the years with so many successful Finnish drivers, there's got to be huge support for a Finnish Grand Prix, but it's never managed to come to fruition, whether it's through funding or complications of where you'd hold it. There must be a number of reasons for it, but yeah, it certainly feels like over the years there would have definitely been enough support. Whether that support in Finland continues, I don't know. The two Finnish drivers on the grid at the moment you would suggest will be coming towards the latter stages of their careers, and so, you know, will that support start to wane away over time? Can we please get a shot of Herbert from the Sky Team? Oh, I love Johnny Herbert. Johnny's a good friend of mine. He doesn't add the gravitas that a Nico Rosberg does, but he does add a bit of comedy and entertainment, and you know, I think he's a worthy addition for that very reason. Right, is lightning as dangerous for F1 as it is for golf? Could a strike cause a big crash? Well, like any car driving, like your road car driving down the road, it's unlikely that a lightning strike would hit a car because it's sat on 4 big rubber contact patches. So I have seen lightning strike a marshal's post at Valencia when we were testing there before, and it caused an enormous flash and bang. And luckily everybody, you know, escaped that unscathed. But in theory, the cars at least should be safe. What it could do, of course, is take out communications if it hits an antenna. It could take out things like race control. Everything around F1 is related to communications and things travelling over the airways, whether it's data signals and that kind of thing. So if you wipe out an antenna, it could have a really major, you know, quite major effect. Was it fair that Stroll received the same penalty as Bottas? Was he not just trying to get out of the way of the carnage? I think it is fair. That was from Tammy J. I think it is fair. I don't think he was just trying to get out of the way of the carnage. I think he in a similar way, obviously not quite as extreme, but he also got caught out with a braking into that corner. And I feel like, because I watched the replay of this a couple of times, he was actually trying to avoid, I forget who it was now, in front of him first time around. And it was only then when he tried to cut the corner to try and avoid crashing into the back of whoever it was it Daniel Ricciardo, I think, that he ended up, you know, being out of control and hitting that car. So yeah, I think it's the same sort of thing. It's you know, he was wholly to blame for that standalone incident, as Valtteri was with his. And as I said before, it's not so much about the consequence or the outcome, it's about the infringement. He went into that corner out of control and was wholly to blame for a collision, so the same penalty should apply. Stroll was out of control as well, says Josh Smith. Yeah, agree. Right, hang on. So, penalty for infringement. Then why penalise only Alfa Romeos for unsafe release? And this is something that I've seen a few people comment on, particularly at the beginning of the race when everyone dived into the pits at the end of the sort of formation lap for that change of tyres. It did feel like a number of people failed to follow the unsafe release protocols, and I think it was Carlos Sainz or Binotto complaining today that you know, they lost out because they did wait until there's a safe gap, whereas others didn't bother and just launched out of their grid box and got back in, or their pit box, and got back into the queue. So I think that's one of those things where they probably could have picked apart some of those and maybe handed out some further penalties. Obviously with the Kimi Raikkonen one, that was a slam dunk. I mean, there was contact. That's incredibly dangerous, and there's no question that that's a penalty. But yeah, I agree with you. To the letter of the law, there could have been others that maybe should have deserved a further penalty too. But I think that what they took was a bit of an overview that everyone was doing it. It was a very kind of unique scenario in that everyone was trying to get back out into the race. Whether that's right or wrong, you can argue amongst yourselves. But I think yes, it could have gone on, and there could have been more penalties for sure. Kimi seems more frustrated with his team than ever before. Do you think he's done with F1? I mean, I don't know the answer to this. I haven't seen Kimi for ages or spoken to him, but I do think he's probably getting frustrated, not only because the team have made a number of mistakes this year. He's one of those guys that does get frustrated with other people's errors, and I know he's made some of his own too. But I think also running around where he is without any real progression, it's more that rather than the fact that he's towards the back of the grid. That's one thing, but the team not showing signs of real progression is something that frustrates him massively. And if he can progress, if the team can move forward through a season, I think he'd be happy to try and continue. I don't feel like he feels that there is that, and therefore he probably is getting frustrated, and may well be that that's one of the reasons that he may not continue. And of course it may be that the team decide they don't want to continue with him either, because his results, let's face it, haven't been quite as strong as we've been used to over previous years. What briefings do pit crews get regarding pit lane safety? This is particularly important when you think of the crazy all-car, every team pit stop moments. Well, there are briefings. Obviously, there's a set of regulations, first and foremost. Then the teams get briefed via the team manager, who then comes and briefs the pit crews themselves. And safety is a big part of what you practice. It's about getting out safely from your garage to the pit lane, getting back in again, when other teams are coming in around you, looking after your equipment, pulling the hoses in. You may have seen that happen. Make sure that when you leave your equipment, you're leaving it in as safe a condition as possible. So everyone's well aware of safety. You know, it's our own safety when we're part of that. So of course you have to take it seriously, and I think most teams do that. Right. Should Red Bull be allowed to try to influence the stewards as much as they did? No, and nor should Mercedes. Ultimately, they'll all play their games through the media, and that's one thing, and I think that's probably happened for years. If you're referring to actually going to see the stewards, as they both did in Silverstone, that is, I feel, unacceptable, and actually it's been clamped down on, so shouldn't be happening again. But this war of words in the media, as I said right at the top of the show, it's part of the game. It's kind of escalated in recent weeks. The drama is building, as is the championship fight, and perhaps the two go hand in hand. And if I think back to the days of McLaren versus Ferrari when I was back at McLaren, it was pretty much the same thing. We had, teams protesting each other, counter-protesting each other, trying to find ways to catch each other out, keeping things deliberately very, very secret from each other, trying to mislead each other. Those games were all happening back then. It's just that we've had a period of, 7 years of utter domination from one team where actually there's been no one else in contention. So many of these things haven't really happened in the same way. I think back to the McLaren versus Renault, when Alonso was at Renault, and the same things were happening then. Technical infringements, protests and counter-protests. These are things that have always happened in Formula One. They're part of the game. And when there's a championship at stake, and let's face it, for Red Bull, this is a championship that has been way out of touch for years. This might be their one and only opportunity for the foreseeable future when everything changes next year. They will feel that they need to go to whatever lengths possible to try and capitalise on the great car that they have. And they can do that on track, but they will be willing to go to whatever lengths they can, off track as well. And look, Mercedes have done the same. This whole flexi wing debate that Mercedes kicked off, it's no different. It's all part of this game. It's part of the politics of it. It's part of the gamesmanship, and part of me likes it. Thanks, Will Williams. That's very kind of you. Are the new construction of tyres favouring Mercedes? I don't know. I don't think we've got any conclusive evidence to say that yet. I think, we've had two kind of topsy-turvy races a little bit, haven't we? Silverstone, and in fact, Silverstone's always been a very strong circuit for Lewis and Mercedes, and so has the Hungaroring. So I think let's give it a few more races to see what happens. I mean, it's been slightly weird in that in terms of the racing, we haven't had Max Verstappen in play for the last two, but between qualifying over the course of the entire race weekend, Mercedes definitely looks stronger, but don't forget they brought a great big update package to their car at Silverstone too, so it's difficult to pinpoint whether the tyres, and look, oh, there's a good opportunity for me to get the mini tyres out again. They're sat here every week. I never can think of a way to use them, but there you go. We're talking about tyres, so I'll show it. The one tyre I haven't got is the intermediate. I've got a blue one. Not that it's got any tread on it, but it's blue. I just didn't get a green one. Anyway, there you go. So yeah, I don't think we can say whether the new tyres have made any performance difference necessarily to anybody. It's too early to say. Alonso, simply Alonso, says RJ Wilkie. Yeah, what a great weekend it was for Fernando Alonso and the entire Alpine team. I mean, yes, they lucked into a huge amount of it, but I touched on it earlier on. I thought the Alonso-Lewis Hamilton battle on track over those few laps was epic. And we've had a few of those, haven't we, in recent races between different drivers. But to see Alonso versus Hamilton, which we haven't really seen since 2007, when they were in our team together, was just brilliant. Brilliant stuff, and I thought that was great. And, he was so pleased for Esteban at the end, having won the Grand Prix. As a team, they will have needed that result massively. You cannot underestimate the boost that it gives a team like that have had a kind of really topsy-turvy period where they've been up and down at different times. To get a result, a team result like the one they got, was absolutely brilliant and will, give them such a boost going into the summer break. What are your thoughts on Alonso holding up Lewis to help Max and Ocon? I don't believe that it was necessarily for that reason at all. I don't think it mattered who was in front. Fernando Alonso did not want to let Lewis Hamilton pass, and nor should he. They were racing for position, and it was great entertainment, and that is why Alonso has come back to Formula One. He wants to race wheel to wheel with the best guys in the world, and he finally got the opportunity to do it this week. 3 minutes to beer time. Thank you very much, Jason Morgan. Right, let's go for one last question. What should we go for? Is the FIA going to address the flexi Mercedes front wing anytime soon? With the Red Bull rear wing, they were right on it. I don't know the answer, but Red Bull definitely want an answer to that. That's one that's rumbling on in the background. There was a wheel-to-wheel touch during Verstappen versus Schumacher, says Jack Jackson. There was. Look, those are the sorts of moments, a little bit like I was talking about at Silverstone, that could have gone horribly wrong. That battle between Mick Schumacher and Max Verstappen, they made contact. Now, Verstappen got away without having a puncture, but it could have very easily gone differently. Could have got a puncture, could have spun off into the barrier, and we'd all be talking about it very differently. But what we're actually saying is, it was great battling on track, it was great racing. And so, a little bit like when I said Lewis and Max going wheel to wheel at Silverstone was great racing, it was a great spectacle. The outcome was terrible for Max in the end, but if they hadn't quite done that, if they touched but continued, we'd be raving about it as being one of the greatest opening laps of all time. So that is what I don't want to discourage with too many harsh penalties, and I'd love to see the drivers sort it out to some degree as long as things are kept relatively safe. And that is my take on all of this stuff. We want to see great racing, and if occasionally you suffer some bad luck as a result of that, there might be another occasion when you get some great luck and it works in your favour, as it did for Alpine and Esteban Ocon and Sebastian Vettel this week, when the seas just parted in front of them on that opening lap and they went through to take advantage of it and have a wonderful race, certainly in terms of Esteban Ocon. Right, that is it, guys. I'm really pleased we got through an hour finally, and there was so much to talk about. We could have gone on for another hour, but it is beer o'clock. We will definitely do the same thing again next week. I know it's a summer break, but I'm around, so if you're around, come back and join me, and there will be plenty to talk about, I'm sure. We haven't covered it all. I don't think we possibly could. So tell your friends, Like the video if you don't mind, share it around on social media, and next week I have a special prize giveaway, I've just remembered, to give away too. So definitely come back next week and you could win a very special prize. Have a great week, folks. I'll see you soon. Ta-da.